Okay, good number of people have already entered our room. More are joining, but I think it's now a good time to start with our event. So, good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to today's online webinar, which is about competitive harmonization and the 28th regime. And we want to discuss pathways to strengthen Europe's global competitiveness. Well, in recent months, the EU's economic priorities, they have somewhat shifted away from the green transition, the digital transition, towards a renewed political drive for competitiveness. At least this is what we can take from the current political rhetoric if we take it by face value. But much of the political discussion here in Brussels has actually been fueled by two recent reports, which are very rich in analysis. And that is the report by Enrico Letta on the future of the European single market and the report by Mario Draghi, which comes out as a call for greater European competitiveness. While both reports are solid in their research and analysis, their recommendations, they remain somewhat loose from what they look at and what they present in terms of numbers and policy trends. And their recommendations are also basically doubling down on approaches that we saw in the past, approaches that have been tried before, such as channeling more EU funding in so-called strategic industries. And when we look at the political conversation here in Brussels, competitiveness indeed seems to have become the elephant in the room, but it remains largely flamed by outdated thinking. Despite the talk of change, skepticism still runs deep, at least amongst those who follow the debate closely. And it seems from an outsider's perspective, a non-government perspective, that still there is very little appetite for deeper legal integration or little appetite to pause on excessive regulation, especially when it comes to digital policy and technology policy. The European Commission, the Council, and the European Parliament, they all appear likely to remain tethered to familiar paths, recent initiatives, recycling initiatives with little innovation. And the result would be a Brussels establishment echoing reform language, but avoiding the bold changes required to achieve true global competitiveness in the future. Our central theme today in our online seminar is competitive harmonization. It is what I would call a novel or innovative concept advocated by ECIPE, spearheaded by work that I am doing to reduce regulatory fragmentation and to foster legal coherence across EU member states. In essence, to explain it in a nutshell, rather than relying on additional public funding, this model proposes much more harmonized and at the same time much more coherent regulations that simplify trade and investment across the EU, especially for SMEs, especially for small companies, startups that have the ambition to grow across EU borders, building on the single market's founding vision of legal liberalization and legal harmonization. And you can think of it in terms of several components. Generally, much more streamlined regulation across as many EU countries as possible, or a 28 regime, to which we will get back in a minute, which would be an optional EU-wide framework to simplify cross-border trade. For example, a new EU-wide trade or an EU-wide legal status to help innovative companies to grow. It could be about coalition of willing member states to pursue more sector-specific or more horizontal policy harmonization without having the full EU consensus. It could also be about large regulatory sandboxes or it could be about a moratorium on new digital or technology regulations to consolidate current frameworks and provide stability and legal certainty. And I think we will also get back to this in a minute. Today, we will focus on only two of these key items under the overarching umbrella of competitive harmonization, the 28 regime, and the second one, the need to arrive at more harmonization and more policy coherence in EU digital and technology policy making. And I'm very pleased today to moderate this session and at the same time introduce two distinguished speakers we are having with us today. We have Adam Barter, who is the director of the Epicenter, the European Policy Information Center based in Brussels. And we have Dominic Doll, senior manager responsible for digitalization and innovation policy at the German Electro and Digital Industry Association based in Frankfurt. While our agenda touches upon these two key themes, I would also like to note already at this stage that two leaders from the Europe Incorporate campaign were invited to join us today, but regrettably they couldn't be here today. But to state this right away, their campaign advocates for a 28 regime to create a pan-European company status designed to help small companies, innovative companies to grow and scale across the EU's internal national borders to benefit from a vast EU market. And with a roadmap to influence the EU's 2025 work program, they want to get this thing being implemented at the EU level. The initiative is led, amongst others, by Allied for Startups. It seeks to address fragmentation and make Europe a much more attractive home for technology startups. And let me also state this, I've just received a letter from Allied for Startups. They've already collected more than 11,000 signatures to support their idea, to support their campaign. The overarching aim, of course, is to make it easier for startups and also other companies that are already established in the EU to engage in cross-border businesses and come closer to the conditions that we find in our benchmark jurisdiction in the Western Hemisphere, the United States, when it comes to the possibility to scale and become competitive in the domestic economy and globally more competitive. Today, we will also explore this idea, but we also want to touch upon other pressing issues. For example, what level of political leadership and commitment is necessary to drive meaningful harmonization in EU policy, including digital and technology policy? Should the EU prioritize a unified framework in digital and data policies? And which inconsistencies in current regulations, such as the Data Act, the DMA, GDPR, need to be addressed first? How should member states be involved in shaping this agenda, including a possible moratorium on new digital policies, potentially also other policies? And what are the opportunities of implementing a 28th regime for cross-border operations in the EU beyond just corporate law? And what could this mean for EU competitiveness at large? So without further ado, let us start with a 10-minute intervention from Dominic, followed by Adam. I look very much forward to an engaging discussion, and I would like to encourage our participants in the audience to share any questions and comments in the chat box throughout our sessions. I will come back to this in the Q&A session when we approach the second half of our seminar. So, Dominic, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Matthias, for hosting this very interesting event and for having me and the opportunity to share ZVE's view on this very important and broad discussed topic. Maybe some words up front about the Z4E, which represents more than 1,100 companies from the electronic and digital industries in Germany, which are mainly active in different sectors, from manufacturing, energy, consumer products, medtech, and components such as chips and semiconductors. And this is also important to mention, our industry is one of the most innovative economic sectors, with spending around 20 billion euros each year for R&D, and highly interlinked on national, European, and international level. So for us, the Z4E, it's clear that the next EU Commission, the next von der Leyen Commission, must be a commission for competitiveness, global partnership, and European resilience at the same time. And we think this can be achieved through strengthening especially key technologies without, and this is very important to mention, without losing focus on the twin transition. Matthias, you have already mentioned it. The digital and green transition is still very important, especially companies already have invested massively to actually achieve this transition and to not create a disturbance or uncertainties. We should still focus on these objectives as well, beside to create more competitiveness. When it comes to the 28th regime, I have to admit I'm not an expert, even though it sounds very promising. However, I have two, let's say, considerations that I want to make here. And as far as I understood, the 28th regime as an optional instrument would mainly cover only private law issues. And I'm not sure whether this can also cover problems of text law, which would definitely require member states to give up sovereignty towards the EU. And I would say I'm less optimistic to see member states actually doing so. But again, maybe there are other ideas how to circumvent this, but I would say this is one of the most problematic issues. Secondly, the regime might sound very appealing for, let's say, investors, with a focus on investing in new approaching technologies. However, and I think that should be considered as well, mid-size or large companies are also investing in startups and scale-ups, maybe based or combined with R&D corporations, and they have to follow sometimes very difficult compliance standards. And so that might create even more administrative burdens if companies need to adhere or follow already in place compliance standards, plus maybe new regulations implemented by the 28th regime. So my point here is that we should take into consideration that, especially for companies that are already registered in the EU and want to cooperate or maybe want to invest, that there is no additional burden, administrative burden, created through an additional regime, so to say. So having said this, again, and this is only my personal view of the 28th regime, as we as Z4E haven't developed a dedicated position on this, I think this can be a good or an important piece of a bigger picture. However, it can only be one single piece. And I think we should focus or consider other instruments and measures as well, suitable for all companies of all sizes, be it for small or even micro scales, small, medium, and large scale companies, to actually create a more competitive EU single market. And we at Z4E actually see three key elements. And I want to touch upon these three briefly. The first one is to reduce the administrative or bureaucratic burden through inconsistencies and coherent regulations, actually what you, Matthias, already mentioned. The second one, and this is even equally important, I would say, is law implementation and enforcement in member states. And there I will give an example why this is so. And thirdly, competitiveness and resilience, especially through innovation. And Matthias, you already mentioned it, and it was also mentioned in the invitation, the Draghi and Letta report, in both highlighted or put innovation in the center as key element for more competitiveness. And I will touch upon this as well, but very briefly, as I just have 10 minutes. So starting with the first aspect, reducing administrative burden. And here I would just focus on digital policies because especially for us, for the ZVE, this area is from particular interest as 2/3 of the turnover for our companies is expected to be gained by digitally enhanced products and digital services by 2026. So it's a key element for them. Deep integration of the European digital single market is actually a prerequisite for ensuring that future competitiveness of their business. And at the same time, I think all of you are aware that the Commission has taken a large number of regulatory measures to promote the development of digital technologies. Many of the legislative acts have now been adopted. Companies are already facing implementation deadlines. Some of them are very short. And we as ZVE have recently published a paper with a focus on incoherencies and double regulations. We have looked at several digital regulations, such as the Data Act, the AI Act, Cyber Resilience Act, GDPR, and so on and so forth. And we found numbers of cases where apparently a lack of coherence between different legislations, overlappings, or double standardizations and dysfunctionalities appears. And these challenges actually, or this create challenges. And it's not only this, I would say these challenges would not only lead to legal uncertainties and the linked costs, administrative costs for companies, but also to unnecessary competitive disadvantages compared to companies in non-EU countries, especially when it comes to placing products on the market here in the EU. So let me say, first point is from our point of view, existing regulations, and I named just some of them, already comprehensively actually address the European Commission's objectives laid out in the digital and data strategy. So there is basically no need for further or additional legislation, neither at the European level nor at the national level, just to say it, beside of implementing acts. Instead, our demand is that the incoming von der Leyen Commission should rather amend existing legislation in such a way that regulatory inconsistencies and double regulations are eliminated. For example, as I said, when it comes to multiple regulations covering the same issue, for example, it is essential to clarify which legal act takes precedence, or which legal act is to be used for the conformity assessment when it comes for product placement on the EU market. So there are several cases that really need to be clarified and to erase these uncertainties for companies. Then I will touch briefly upon the second point I mentioned, which is law implementation and enforcement in member states. First, and I think there the GDPR is a very good example why we need coherence in law implementation, GDPR or with any other regulation, because we see that these different levels of implementation or not having a level playing field, so to say, creates additional uncertainties for companies, or that you have products that can be easily placed on the market, let's say in the Netherlands, for example, but not in Germany because German authorities have another interpretation of the GDPR as the ones in the Netherlands. So, and this definitely creates not only uncertainties, but also additional administrative costs. Plus, and this goes hand in hand, law implementation with enforcement. I think the best example, and you have already heard about this, I'm pretty sure, based on a B2C market is Temu and or any cross-border e-commerce platforms selling products here in the EU. And we have found numerous cases where products which are non-compliant to EU obligations are placed on the market here, or that are sold. And this definitely, and I think that goes without any further explanation, definitely leads to a competitive disadvantage for EU companies, because they need to be, or they need to adhere to all the obligations, and that makes their products more costly, and they need to compete with other companies placing their products here with less, let's say, development costs for their products. And so what we need here is definitely more and strict enforcement in member states, which maybe also require more competences for the EU. Because what we see is that member states alone are not capable to cover all the enforcement by their own. And then lastly, and then I come to an end, competitiveness and resilience through innovation. And as I already mentioned, Letta and Draghi, both reports, they highlighted that competitiveness can only be achieved through innovation. And I think their assessment in general of the current situation or of the status is correct. And I think it's correct that it's crucial not only to avoid, let's say, one-sided dependencies, but also to establish strategic technological ecosystems where the EU takes the lead. We see currently China is leading globally in, I think, 37 out of 44 critical technologies. Gartner listed some, and we see definitely that China is leading while Europe is lagging behind. So what we need is to size control points in already existing value chains, and we need to create new value chains to actually create mutual dependencies. Plus, or this eventually leads to create more bargaining power for the EU. So this is basically the foundation for more independency. However, at the same time, what we see is that Europe is rather good at fundamental research, but we are lagging behind actually industrial application of this research, again, compared to China and the US. So we should more focus on value creation, technology promotion, commercialization, valorization. And I think especially the Draghi report made some good recommendations how to achieve this. However, the proposed instruments and measures mostly seem to focus rather on strengthening the startup scene and filling the scale-up gap on critical and deep technologies in Europe without considering our actually strengths. So we should not lose focus of our current industry advantage. And I would say this is definitely the manufacturing sector. That is automatization, that is industrial and AI, that is robotics. So my idea is not to focus too much, or I wouldn't say lose time and money, that goes too far, but that we not lose focus by focusing too much on startups and scale-ups, but to consider our actually strength and strengthen the strengths, so to say. So that we need more investment towards higher TRLs, that we should emphasize on the added value of the money spent for the EU performance and competitiveness. So, and that we do not, let's say, bet everything on new technologies put forward by scale-ups and startups. Nevertheless, what we need is definitely a balanced approach between fueling existing European strength, as I mentioned, and targeted development of new competences to be competitive or reduce or to create more resilience. So this is in a nutshell where we see as ZVE, or these three elements, I would say this is what we see as core or basis for more competitiveness when it comes to innovation, and especially reduce bureaucratic burden and and through or to create more consistency and coherent regulations.
Yeah, great, Dominic. Thank you very much for this first intervention, also for highlighting the key issues that you have on your agenda as a representative of the Electro Digital Industry Association in Germany. Let me ask you a brief follow-up question. I have put in our chat box an overview of publications that are worthwhile to look into, including your paper about inconsistencies in how you call it, inconsistencies and double regulation in digital and technology policy making.
Right.
So it's in German, but dear audience, you may want to run it through a translation engine, and I can only recommend to go through it. It's rich in examples. And in this paper, you and your colleagues, they mention the Data Act, the Cyber Resilience Act, machinery regulation, if I understand it correctly. Now, I would be interested in positions from your members. Did they actually actively call for new regulation in these areas, or do they feel a bit kind of overstrained by single sets of regulations and then the, let's say, the cumulated set of regulations?
Yeah. First, let me say we already have published the English version of this paper. Hopefully next week, due to some autumn vacations here in Germany. But hopefully next week the paper will be accessible on our website, and I'm more than happy to share this with anyone who's interested in the English version. So just drop me an email. I'll send it to you via email as well. Now to your question. Definitely there was no need, no ask for further regulation, especially, let me just pick out one of them, the Data Act. The Data Act is based on a survey promoted by the EU Commission, solely focusing on the agriculture and the automotive industry, and never has assessed the manufacturing industry, for example. They assumed a situation that is basically not the reality in the manufacturing and the robotic sector, for example. So we are already working on a scheme for trustful data sharing and the use of and fair data sharing and the use of data. And now we get this regulation on top, which actually just creates more of a burden with unconcrete or unprecise definition what actually needs to be shared, which data is in scope, who is or the Data Act implements several roles, and now companies are facing the challenge to actually assess which role they are, what obligations they have stemming from the Data Act, and so forth and so on. When it comes to the AI Act, we were one of the few associations, to be honest, which to the very last end said this is basically not thought throughout fully, the AI Act. The same applies here as well. Definitions are very vague. The concepts are still very, or are not very adaptable to companies applying AI, especially industrial AI. And what we see is that AI applied or software applied, algorithm applied in industrial areas are now falling under the scope of AI Act, which can even be, let's say, harmful AI, which was before not. So now we try to fix all these issues with lists and I don't know, with gray lists and white lists, which are good, but actually are not needed if you would have thought through the needs beforehand. So to summarize, or coming back to your question, actually, no, there was no need for further legislation.
Thanks for responding. We will certainly come back to this theme in a minute. Now, Adam, I would like to hand over to you. Um, what is your position? Also, let's say, based on the work that the Epicenter did in the recent past, but I also know the past decade or so about legal fragmentation, the need for more harmonization when it comes to approaching a more efficient, better functioning European single market against the background of what we read and what we nowadays hear about the Letta and the Draghi report and the overarching theme of European competitiveness.
Thank you, Matthias. Indeed, after 3 decades of the single market, we are ripe for reform. And as you have said at the beginning, there has been a massive shift in the Brussels bubble when it comes to talking about regulation and competitiveness. So last term, pretty much everyone was talking about how the EU can be first to regulate. First to regulate when it comes to the tech industry, first to regulate when it comes to the green transition, first to implement bans, whether it's a ban in Germany on nuclear or the ban on the combustion engine. And now finally, politicians slowly realize that all these regulations and all these bans have costs. And I think Draghi and Letta played a massive role in that mentality shift. So both ex-Italian prime ministers, ironically, they have pointed out that the US and China are leading economic competitiveness. The EU is massively lagging behind. And part of the reason is overregulation, as they correctly identified, and part of the reason is the fragmentation of the single market. So let me spend a couple of minutes on both, because I think they're equally important. On the overregulation side of things, just to give you a pretty shocking statistic, since the implementation of the Lisbon Treaty, the volume of EU regulation has doubled. So we have significantly more rules that the EU companies need to follow compared to 2 terms ago. Specifically, we talked a lot about tech regulation, and I think we talk about tech regulation in particular because, as Draghi has identified in his report, a lot of the economic growth and a lot of increased productivity in the United States was because of the tech scene there. So in a lot of metrics, I think Dominic talked quite rightly about the manufacturing sector. We have been doing all right. The situation is not so dire. Where the situation is really truly dire is the new economy, so the tech sector. Dominic touched on the AI Act and rightly mentioned that it hasn't been thought through. I couldn't agree more. This is something that should have never existed in the first place. Just to give you an idea about the kind of precautionary mentality behind the AI Act, if you need a computer that has enough computing capacity to turn an LLM like ChatGPT-4, you need to have special permissions obtained by the European Union. Imagine if someone said at the end of the 70s, early 90s, that Apple won a computer that had less computing capacity than the watch that I currently have. Imagine if they were told that you need to have special permissions in order to develop your software further, develop your computing capacities further. I mean, it's just an extreme barrier to growth that really a lot of people haven't really been acknowledging simply because the EU wanted to say that we are the first to regulate X area. This has been a massive mistake, but it's not the only mistake. If you look at the Digital Markets Act, if you look at the Digital Services Act, very similar mistakes were made there in the name of more rights for consumers, at least in theory. It's an example that I like to use at conferences where I need to find the venue where I need to go. I used to just type into Google search where I need to go, then it pops up with a couple of hits and it pops up with Google Maps. So I just click on Google Maps and I can directly find where I need to go. Today, I can't do that in the European Union anymore. It's simply banned. It's banned because the European legislators thought that it's unfair competition, and they are helping competition if they actually ban through DMA easy access for essentially venues and maps. So there are countless examples. It's seemingly tiny, but I think important examples in our day-to-day regulation, how we're making the life of consumers and of companies that need to apply these regulations on a day-to-day basis, how we make our own lives significantly more difficult through over-regulation. So this is the first part, over-regulation. Second part is fragmentation that you have also mentioned. I think the fragmentation of the EU single market is a bit more tricky because on the one hand, it has clearly negative consequences. It means more compliance with more jurisdictions. The 27 jurisdictions are obviously quite different in their attitude towards taxation, their attitude towards labor regulation, etc. But on the other hand, it also means that there is some competition between jurisdictions. So if you take tax competition, for example, the fact that Central Eastern European countries have on average, better tax systems than most Western European countries, the fact that Central Eastern European countries have on average better labor laws than most Western European countries, I think this encourages some competition between EU member states and the governments, which can be a positive thing. Obviously, the negative downside is that if European companies or if foreign companies in Europe want to scale, it's a lot more difficult and a lot more cumbersome to comply with 27 different jurisdictions and their regulations compared to just one. So given that, we have the over-regulatory angle and we have the fragmentation angle, I think it's worth asking what the ideal solutions are, and because we don't live in an ideal world, what the realistic solutions may be. I think it's not worth spending too much time on the ideal solution because it may be a bit wishful thinking. But my wishful thinking, at least from a pro-market liberal perspective, would be if the EU were to implement the tax system of Switzerland or Estonia, the labor laws of Denmark, and the financial markets of the United Kingdom, then I think we could sit back and watch our economy grow. I don't think that life is that easy, so I want to propose some realistic solutions as well. And one of the realistic solutions, I believe, is just to stop. To stop, breathe out, and not implement any further EU directives, EU legislation that is increasing the cost of compliance for our own companies. I think just stopping the increase of regulation would be already a great first step. If I want to go a bit further, then you also talked a little bit about EU Incorporated, which I think is a very good idea. And the idea of the 28th regime, which is essentially a new entity that could be established in addition to the 27 jurisdictions that are already there between the member states, can help with further economic growth. I think the idea behind the 28th regime is fourfold. First of all, you have standardization. It would help to standardize the investment processes and actually create genuinely pan-European investments. Secondly, I think it would set some of the incentives right that are currently lacking for a lot of European startups. So at the moment, stock options in the United States, for example, are a lot more positive if you are a startup entrepreneur compared to many European countries. I think Belgium even taxes unrealized gains. So a lot of entrepreneurs would need to pay a crazy amount of tax even just on the valuation of their company, even before they made a single cent. Obviously, no Belgian entrepreneur is going to stay in the country. They will all go to the United States. So if we set the incentives right, for our entrepreneurs, I think that would be a very positive development of the 28th regime. It would also simplify cross-border operations as a third main point. Now, obviously, if an employer has to comply with many different labor laws, it can make expanding the country or expanding the company beyond the borders of a country significantly more tricky. And fourth, last but not least, really digitizing the incorporation process of companies. So if you look at Estonia, for example, setting up a company in Estonia takes about 2 hours. In many European countries, it's a lot more cumbersome. So I think the idea has gained a lot of traction in recent weeks. I hope it's going to gain further traction once the new College of Commissioners get appointed. But Draghi also mentioned a couple of other points, which I would like to very briefly expand on. He mentioned the lack of capital markets union, which is obviously a major hindrance for the growth of European companies. Getting funding from banks is extremely slow and cumbersome. The venture capital market doesn't exist in the EU in the same way as it does in the US. And our pension systems are essentially mainly to blame for it. I know it sounds contradictory. Why am I talking about pensions? How does that link into the problem? But I promise it does, simply because most of the European pension systems are based on redistribution. So the current working people are paying the pensions of the retired people. In the US and in a couple of European countries like Denmark and the Netherlands, pensions are based on a system of capitalization. So you invest a lot of the money that you have, and you live off that money when you grow old. Obviously, if working age people would be investing that money today, that would give the capital, that would give the necessary cash to a lot of European companies that are in dire need of it. We talked a little bit about trade as well. So if you look at the lack of mutual recognition between geopolitical allies such as the UK and the United States and the EU, there is a massive lack of mutual recognition. And in an ideal world, the 28th regime could potentially have non-EU members as well. And the last point that I wanted to raise was how FDI screening, for example, contributes to the lack of funding for some of our startups. So at the moment, it's not just at the moment, actually over the years, it has become increasingly more strict to get essentially funding from non-EU third country funders. So in many countries, like in the Czech Republic, it needs to be approved on a cabinet level above a certain pretty low sum if a company wants to attract foreign direct investment. I think this over-centralization is extremely difficult. It hinders economic growth. And essentially, if we could implement an FDI screening that exists mostly for questionable countries, I can understand why we want to screen some of the Chinese or Russian investments. But if we do the same with our geopolitical allies, I think there is less of an argument for it. So limiting the use of FDI screening would tremendously help to kickstart economic growth a bit more robustly in the European Union. So I will leave it at that. And if you would like to, very happy to dive into the details during the Q&A as well.
Yeah, super, Adam. A very rich intervention. Thank you very much indeed. Let me follow up on the capital markets union, which is a common theme raised by Draghi and Letta, and we hear about it for the past 2 decades at the very least. But we've not seen so much progress. You mentioned venture capital. I recently came across some numbers stating that venture capital per citizen here in the EU is about $60 equivalent per year. In the US, it's about 600. Most of the money coming from private entities, while in the EU, 80% of the $60 per year is coming from the European Investment Bank. The same source indicated that most family offices in Europe, they funnel their money to the United States to invest there. And a big argument in favor of investing in the US is that companies that have promising business models, startup businesses, or those that you highlighted, Dominic, established businesses, if they roll out business models, they tend to be much more profitable because they can rapidly roll out their business model from, let's say, the Silicon Valley to Detroit or to Miami and the other way around, which is not the case in Europe because we have 24 official languages plus 27 different legal regimes for all sorts of things, including tax policies, labor market policies, social security laws, which obviously have to be taken into account by all companies irrespective of industry. So I wonder where we can make progress here. And I think the 28 regime, it can be applied to these areas as well. So for example, we do not need to harmonize tax regimes across member states, but we could harmonize the calculation method for tax bases, for example, and leave it to the member states to set rates according to their own national preferences, if there is something such as a national preference, of course. Speaking a bit to what you pointed out at the beginning, Adam, when you referred to the importance to maintain a certain degree of institutional competition. So my follow-up question basically to you, Adam, can we actually expect substantial shifts in EU policy making without broader institutional reforms? And I'm asking this because when we've had Enrico Letta joining one of our seminars here at ECIPE, he was saying that the 28 regime is kind of an elegant idea to circumvent the lack of political appetite for big institutional reforms. So what would your opinion be here? Also, perhaps a reply to a second question, what type of political leadership and what type of vision is actually essential to successfully implement regulatory harmonization with or without underlying institutional reforms at the EU level?
Very interesting question. And I think it links back to the problem of, do we want to create the ideal world, or do we take it into account that we have 27 EU member states with massively divergent political and economic views on the world? And I think Enrico Letta is absolutely right. The 28th regime is a very elegant way of bypassing that problem. And I think we are bypassing that problem because we cannot tackle it head on. If we open the Pandora box of treaty change and EU's own resources, taxation, etc., we're going to end up with another term, 5 years of endless debates. And we're not going to agree on it. There will be some member states that will veto it. There will be member states that really want to push for further centralization and harmonization, if you like. I mean, France being the main one of them. And there will be EU member states that acknowledge the shortcomings of these harmonized attitudes, and they will veto it all. So I think the 28th regime is really something that we can implement in the short term. It also means practically that we can have a very thin layer of regulatory framework as the 28th regime, right? So if the 28th regime were copying everything that France has implemented over the last 3 decades, then it would be pointless. Then it would be a horrible idea and it would never work. The point is that we can have a very thin regulatory regime that may also encourage some of the member states to rethink how they approach some of the labor law and tax questions. I mean, Belgium would be forced to rethink taxing unrealized gains. I think that would be a net benefit to the citizens of Belgium and to entrepreneurs there. So introducing kind of a competitive regulatory layer in addition to the existing ones, I think that would be very positive. Whether member states would go for it, I hope so, simply because they have to realize that we are massively lagging behind. We had a conversation in the European Parliament last week where the question was, are we lagging behind? Are we at crossroads? I mean, this could have been a question 15 years ago. Today, it's not. Today, it's so obvious how much poorer the European Union is compared to the United States. And this is really the last wake-up call. If the member states are vetoing any kind of economic reform, then we can sit here in 10 years' time in a nice little museum and reminisce about the good old times when the European Union still mattered.
Yeah, that's my impression as well. We've had the same debate 25 years ago, ahead of the year 2000 with the arrival of the Lisbon agenda for competitiveness. So there's no need to be no reason to be overly optimistic. Irrespective of that, I would like to encourage our audience to put some questions in the chat box. We still have time to, I think, address 2 or 3 questions from participants in the audience. Before we do so, a follow-up question to you, Dominic. You have mentioned our kind of global geopolitical and competitive landscape. You've briefly referred to the Data Act, the AI Act, 2 legislative pieces that we do not see in the United States. So my question would be, given the high density of digital regulations in the EU, how do you see regulatory fragmentation and new digital policies piling up or that have piled up in the past 5 years impacting European companies' competitiveness on a global scale, especially when we compare the EU acquis and also the EU economic situation to a less regulated market such as the United States?
Yeah, that's very interesting, especially considering what Adam said, that the number of regulation has doubled, especially in the tech environment. And I think what we actually would need is now for companies time to implement and to adapt the regulations. Otherwise, and that is actually what we see now, that more and more personnel and money is channeled to actually implementing activities. And this gives a disadvantage in competitiveness. And what we see is that member states recognize this and they see that this is actually a burden, a very, very severe burden for companies and for the competitiveness here. However, I am a little concerned that even though the assessment of Draghi and other reports are clear that we do not need more regulation, that the incoming Commission and the EP will not just focus on amending and assessing current legislation, especially when looking at the mission letters and at the outline of von der Leyen's policy priorities. There are some hints that clearly indicate that new regulations are on the horizon already. Just mentioned the what is it called, the EU digital strategy. So I have no idea. None of the EU Commission representatives could actually say what in detail encompasses this strategy. However, there will be. I'm very sure there will be more regulations. Maybe one sentence, Adam, what you said at the very last regarding the economic reform, and this also goes to what you asked, Matthias. When it comes to competitiveness, I think in general, more general, and this is not only in regard of digital policies, what we need in the EU and with member states is a discussion of what or in what regard do we talk about competitiveness? Is it, or I see two tracks actually that goes in parallel. On the one side, we say we want to create a fair single market which accelerate internal competitiveness fair competitiveness. And on the other side, we have this discussion going on, which says, okay, we need to be competitive against China and the US and India respectively. However, how this comes together, let me give you one example. The merger of Alstom and Siemens, what actually that the EU Commission prevented or denied, actually shows the problem. Because on the one hand side, the merger would have created an undisputed market leader in very high-speed trains, which is too big for EU scale in the view of the EU Commission. But on the other side, to be really competitive as EU, as one bloc, this would actually the size needed to be competitive on a global scale. So I think before we talk about reforms, economic reforms, I think we should make sure for ourselves in what regard do we talk about competitiveness. I see this two tracks can go hand in hand, but I don't see that these two discussions are, let's say, or that these issues or topics are discussed in combination, but rather in parallel. And I think that that needs to be done, that we have to a concrete or common understanding what competitiveness actually means for us as EU on global scale as well.
Yeah, it's a very good example. And I think in competition policy, there may be light at the end of the tunnel. The Commission has already indicated to, in a way, pave the way for the creation of national champions.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is going to be limited to the railway industry. It will probably apply to other companies as well. And as long as it's a kind of a consumer-centric approach to competition policy, I think it's okay. We have two questions from our audience. First question, how much of this growth in EU regulations since Lisbon, the inconsistencies across the regulation, is also hindered or impacted by the distribution of portfolios within the European Commission / silos, regulatory silos, fragmented portfolios? Adam, is this a question that you feel comfortable answering?
Yeah, I don't think there is perfect data on whether it has been driving or whether it has been driven by the 27 commissioners or the existence of them. My suspicion would be yes. I mean, if you were to design an ideal civil service, you definitely wouldn't have 27 commissioners. So that needs to be reformed. But again, without the treaty negotiations, I think that's extremely difficult to do. Just because I know that we have very limited time, I think there's also a question on whether these issues have been new or not. Of course, they are not new issues. As Matthias, you also mentioned, this has been there with the Lisbon competitiveness discussions as well. The problem is that, I mean, it's a blessing and a problem in a way, but the blessing is the EU has massively expanded over the last couple of decades. So kind of having a cohesive opinion between member states has become more difficult. How to address that without treaty reform? I think, you know, the 28th regime elegantly bypasses the problem, but it's not a permanent fixed solution.
Yeah.
And maybe to add on, I think it's not only the number, it's only the incoherences. Even though we have this nice instrument, which is called Better Regulation Toolbox, I don't see that this is actually applied. When we looked at the different regulations and the incoherences stemming from that, this actually indicates that the commissions dealing with the regulations do not talk to each other properly. So, and I mean, starting there, that would be a benefit in itself, but yeah.
Okay, one more comment that is worthwhile to lay out here as well, which is about trade policy. So in addition to all the issues that we have just discussed concerning the EU's digital market, so what's happening inside the EU, the comment is that I think we are also suffering from a lack of appetite to negotiate and conclude meaningful trade agreements. and focusing on trade agreements and also negotiations for quite some time now, and referring to our previous question, I think trade policy is a perfect example to see some dysfunctionalities inside the European Commission with DG Trade trying to stick to the old principles of improving market access globally, but also improving market access for others outside the EU when it comes to investing and trading with the EU. They are increasingly under pressure from departments that have a different political priority agenda, including DG Agriculture, but also DG Environment, DG Development, DEFCO, and so on and so forth. So there are obviously multiple problems. We cannot address all of them today, certainly. I think we have addressed most of the issues that were flagged by our audience. One more is left. Would a 28 regime cover also association? Would it make sense to start there as well? I would say yes. It's definitely worthwhile to consider a 28 regime to be adopted in any policy area. Whether it makes sense or not is a different question, and the answers will obviously very often be political at the end of the day. So are there any final comments you would like to raise, Dominic, Adam?
We need to crack on with all these things. That's my big recommendation to our elected politicians and the European Commission.
Okay, very good. So I think political inertia, political complacency, these are two issues that are important to be addressed in the general debate about the need for reform and what needs to be done at the EU level and also in the member states. Much of the lack of political willingness to do more or less at the EU level is coming or not coming from the member states. So that said, thank you all for joining us today. I think it's been an important discussion about ways to effectively strengthen European competitiveness in the future and steps needed to avoid political complacency. So let's, in a way, carry forward this momentum. And I think we agree that there is a lot of momentum if you follow the debates here in Brussels, a priority shift towards competitiveness. To push for a meaningful change in Europe and a meaningful change in Europe's regulatory landscape. So thank you very much again, wishing you all the best. And I look forward to continue this dialogue with you. And I can only encourage our audience to visit the pages of ZWEI and the Epicenter and go through their content, which is a rich source of information and education about how to change EU regulatory policy and the single market for the better. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Matthias.